Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The house beyond the fog. It was early October when Jamie moved into the old house on the edge of town. The house had been abandoned for years, hidden behind layers of fog that seemed to roll in from the forest every morning. The locals always spoke about it in hushed tones, as if the place was cursed. But to Jamie, it was perfect: cheap rent, lots of space, and the promise of peace and solitude. The first time Jamie saw the house, it was everything he had hoped for. An old Victorian-style building, large windows covered in dust, and a rickety front porch. The roof sagged slightly, and ivy had climbed up the side of the house, wrapping itself around the walls like a vine trying to reclaim what was once its own. He didn't think much about the rumors, the stories of strange noises, the eerie lights flickering in the dead of night, and the sudden disappearances of past tenants. He didn't care about the whispers of people who had lived nearby and claimed to have seen things that were impossible to explain. What mattered was that the house was his, and that was enough. The day he moved in, the fog was thick, swirling around the house like something alive. He could barely see the edge of the yard, and the trees that lined the property were nothing more than dark shadows in the distance. As Jamie unloaded his boxes, he felt a strange sense of unease. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the wind carried an odd scent, damp, like earth in decay. But it wasn't the fog or the scent that unsettled him. It was the silence. The absolute, unnerving quiet. Even the birds seemed to avoid the house. It was as if the world outside had forgotten it existed, and the house itself was standing still, frozen in time. That night, as Jamie lay in bed, the silence felt even more oppressive. The usual sounds of the town, distant traffic, the hum of streetlights, were absent. The wind howled outside, but there was no comfort in it. The walls of the house seemed to breathe, creaking and groaning as if the house was alive, waiting. Then, as he was drifting off to sleep, he heard it. A soft thump, followed by another, then a scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. He froze, listening intently. The sounds were coming from the floor above him, the attic, perhaps. But that didn't make sense. The attic was empty. He'd checked earlier that day. The thumping continued, louder now, more urgent. It seemed to be moving around the house, traveling from room to room. Jamie sat up in bed, staring into the darkness. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. It wasn't just the noise. There was something else, something wrong. A presence in the house. A feeling that he was being watched. With a deep breath, he forced himself to get out of bed. He had to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and slowly crept toward the staircase. The house groaned underfoot as he moved, the floorboards creaking with every step. The beam of the flashlight wavered as his hand shook, but he pushed on. He reached the hallway and glanced toward the stairs. The light was dim, casting long shadows across the walls. The thumping had stopped, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. The sound sent a chill down Jamie's spine. He made his way to the staircase and paused. Something in the air had changed. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him, and yet, he couldn't turn back. His curiosity, and something else, drove him forward. As he reached the top of the stairs, the sounds stopped. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. There was a heaviness in the air, as if something unseen was lurking just out of view. Jamie's heart raced as he reached the door to the attic. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond. He pushed the door open, his flashlight illuminating the empty space inside. The attic was bare, save for a few old boxes and a dusty, forgotten chair in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place. No strange noises, no signs of movement. Just the stillness, and the faint scent of something old, something forgotten. But as Jamie turned to leave, he noticed something strange, something that hadn't been there before. The chair, once facing away from him, now sat turned toward the door, its back to the wall. It was as though someone had moved it while he was standing in the room. He froze, staring at the chair. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Had someone been in here with him? Or was it just his mind playing tricks on him? Before he could process the thought, the scratching sound returned, louder this time, and coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It was no longer distant. It was right outside the attic door, almost as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. Jamie's blood ran cold. His legs felt like lead as he turned toward the door. But before he could move, a voice, soft and chilling, whispered from the darkness. "Leave now, before it's too late." The voice was faint, distant, but it was clear. Jamie's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The words echoed in his mind as if they had been branded into his skull. He had to leave. But the house wouldn't let him. He could feel it, the weight of something dark pressing him from all sides. In a panic, Jamie rushed down the stairs, his flashlight shaking wildly in his hand. He had to get out. He had to escape. But as he reached the front door, he stopped. The door was no longer open, no longer a way out. It was shut tight, locked from the inside. Panic rose in his chest as he yanked at the door, desperately trying to force it open. The scratching sound was now all around him, moving faster, louder, coming from every direction. The walls seemed to close in on him, the house shifting, groaning like it was alive, like it was closing in on him. "Hello, Jamie." The voice came again, clear this time, as though it was standing right behind him. Jamie spun around, his flashlight falling to the floor. The beam flickered for a moment before going dark. He was not alone. Chapter 2, The Dark Presence. Jamie's heart raced, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as he stood frozen in the pitch-black entryway. The voice, whispered so chillingly, so close, echoed in his ears. He couldn't bring himself to turn around, couldn't bring himself to face whatever was behind him. But the tension in the air was unbearable. He could feel it, the presence creeping ever closer, pressing down on him like the weight of the house itself. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were being clawed at from the inside. And then, there was another sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. A gentle tapping, almost like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was there was savoring the fear it had caused. Jamie spun around, his eyes wide, searching the darkness for the source of the noise. But there was nothing. The hallway was empty. The front door, still locked, seemed to mock him, holding him prisoner inside the house. His flashlight flickered again, casting an eerie glow that only heightened the feeling of being watched. "Leave now, before it's too late." The voice came again, closer this time, right behind him. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The cold air was suffocating, as if the house had turned against him, trying to trap him within its walls. Every instinct told him to run, to break down the door or find any way to escape. But something held him in place. A terror he couldn't explain, something beyond fear, was slowly paralyzing him. He had to move, had to escape, but his legs wouldn't obey. "Jamie," the voice whispered once more, so close now that it seemed to seep into his very bones. And then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow, shifting in the corner of his vision, something too large to be just a trick of the light. It flickered in and out of the beam of his dying flashlight, as though it were too insubstantial to be real. But Jamie knew it was real. And it was coming closer. His pulse quickened. His mind screamed at him to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of whatever was closing in on him. But the fear, no, the sheer terror, kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't see it clearly, but the shadow seemed to move with purpose. And then, as it stepped fully into the dim light of the hallway, Jamie's breath hitched in his throat. It was a figure. A silhouette, almost human in shape, but distorted, twisted. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its face was hidden in shadow, but Jamie could feel its eyes upon him, cold and relentless. "Leave now," the voice repeated, its tone dark and commanding. "Before it finds you." Suddenly, Jamie's feet moved on their own, his body acting out of pure instinct. He bolted for the door, his hand slamming against the knob, his heart pounding in his chest as if it were going to burst. But the door didn't open. It wouldn't budge. "No," Jamie gasped, panic flooding his chest as he pulled at the door again, harder, desperately. But it stayed locked, the house unwilling to release him. The shadow in the hallway moved closer, and with every inch it took, the temperature in the room dropped. It felt like ice was crawling beneath his skin, like the very air was turning solid. Jamie's teeth chattered as he turned, searching frantically for another way out. That's when he saw it, the window. The old, dust-covered window to his left. It was cracked open just enough. Without thinking, Jamie rushed toward it, his hand outstretched. But before he could reach it, he heard a sound, a low growl, coming from the shadows. The figure wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving toward him, its long, thin arms stretching unnaturally, its fingers clawing at the air as it reached for him. With a final, desperate shove, Jamie forced the window open. The cold air hit him like a slap, but he didn't care. He squeezed through, pushing his body through the narrow opening and out into the night. He landed on the ground with a thud, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He could hear the wind howling around him, and the night was still, eerily silent. But as Jamie scrambled to his feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching him, its dark eyes following his every movement. He turned to look back at the house. The lights inside flickered once more, and for a brief moment, Jamie thought he saw a figure standing at the window, watching him. He couldn't see its face, but he could feel it. The eyes were on him. And the shadow, the thing in the house, was waiting. His legs carried him forward, faster than he had ever run before, through the fog in the trees, the house shrinking behind him. Every instinct told him to run, to keep going, to escape whatever had just been unleashed inside those walls. But as Jamie looked over his shoulder, he saw it again. The shadow. It was following him. Not running, not chasing, but walking, gliding silently through the fog, getting closer with every step. Jamie's breath quickened. He had to lose it. He had to find safety. But the figure was relentless. It wasn't in a hurry. It was simply following him, knowing that Jamie couldn't outrun it. Chapter 3: The Pursuit. Jamie ran, his feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted through the thick fog that enveloped the forest. The chill in the air cut through him, but it was nothing compared to the icy grip of fear tightening around his chest. He didn't dare look behind him, but he could feel it, the presence. That ever-watchful, creeping shadow, following him with a certainty that sent a wave of terror surging through his veins. His legs burned as he pushed himself harder, faster. The dense trees blurred around him, the underbrush cracking beneath his feet, but all he could hear was the sound of his own frantic breathing and the distant echo of something following in his wake. The fog pressed in closer, thickening around him, wrapping him in a suffocating cloak of white. For the first time, Jamie wondered if he was running from something that couldn't be outrun. The ground beneath his feet seemed uneven, as if the earth itself were trying to pull him down, to stop him. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though invisible hands were reaching up to drag him back toward the house. He stumbled once, then twice, before catching his balance. His mind screamed for him to stop, to rest, but there was no time for that. The figure in the fog was closer now, too close. He could feel it, its presence looming just behind him, its very existence a nightmare he could not escape. In a desperate bid to break free, Jamie veered to the right, darting off the main path and into the dense thicket of trees. His breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed his way through the underbrush, branches scraping at his skin, the cold air filling his lungs. But the fog seemed to close in faster, and with each step he took, the world around him grew darker. The trees no longer appeared to be trees. They were shadows, tall, skeletal, and twisted. The more he ran, the more the landscape seemed to change, warping and bending in ways that didn't make sense. He had run these woods before, during the day, and the trees had never looked like this. As he pushed forward, the distant growl of something unearthly reached his ears, low and guttural, almost like a warning. It sent a jolt of panic through his body. He had to get out, but every step he took felt like it was leading him deeper into a trap. And then, it happened. The ground beneath Jamie's feet gave way. One moment he was running, and the next, the earth crumbled, and he found himself falling into nothing. He screamed, his body twisting in midair, but there was nothing to grab onto, nothing to break his fall. He hit the ground with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment, he lay still, dazed, his ears ringing with the pounding of his own heartbeat. When he finally managed to sit up, his vision blurred. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around him like a living thing. His chest tightened, the weight of the air pressing in from all sides. He tried to steady himself, his hands shaking as he pushed himself to his feet. That's when he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the fog, standing at the edge of the ravine where he had fallen. Its shape was distorted, almost monstrous in appearance. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, its face still hidden in shadow. But even in the dim light, Jamie could feel its eyes on him, burning into him with an intensity that paralyzed him. The growling sound returned, louder this time, almost deafening. It was a sound of something ancient, something primal, like an animal preparing to strike. Jamie's breath quickened. His legs trembled beneath him, his muscles screaming for him to move, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure in front of him hadn't moved, hadn't stepped any closer, but the air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if it was closing in. The voice came again, soft, but unmistakable. "You can't escape. Not from me. Not from this place." Jamie's pulse hammered in his ears. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. It was as though the very air had frozen him in place. Then, the figure did move. It stepped forward, slow and deliberate, each movement like a calculated step closer to his doom. The ground beneath Jamie's feet seemed to tremble with each step the figure took. The fog parted around it, but it didn't clear the way. It only added to the weight, the dread, the sense that this was no ordinary pursuit. The figure wasn't just following him. It was guiding him, drawing him towards something darker. Jamie felt his chest tighten as the figure loomed ever closer, its presence suffocating. And in that moment, as the thing finally closed the gap, he saw its face, a pale, lifeless face with hollow eyes that seemed to bore through him. Its grin was wide, unnatural, stretching too far across its face. "You're mine now," the figure said in a voice that wasn't a voice, but a whisper inside his head. "The house is waiting." Before Jamie could react, before he could even scream, the ground shifted beneath him. The earth seemed to come alive, pulling at him, dragging him back toward the dark depths. The trees loomed overhead, their skeletal branches reaching for him, as if they were part of some larger, twisted force. The voice echoed again, this time louder. "The door is open, and you've already stepped through it." Jamie fought, his hands clawing at the earth, but it was useless. The ground beneath him pulled harder, and before he knew it, he was falling again, into something darker, deeper, more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. As the world spun around him, he caught one last glimpse of the figure above him, its eyes locked on his. The shadow followed, relentless and omnipotent, pulling him deeper into the unknown. Chapter 4: The Depths of the Unknown. The world around Jamie spun in chaotic spirals. The ground seemed to give way beneath him, yet there was no sense of direction, no sense of falling, just the constant pull of gravity and the ever-present weight of the air. He didn't know how far he had fallen, nor if he was even still in the same place. Everything felt distorted, like he was trapped between two realities, neither fully grounded in the physical world. His body hit something soft, like a thick layer of moss, yet the impact was harsh enough to leave him breathless. His senses swirled with disorientation, the faint smell of earth and mildew mixing with the copper tang of fear in his mouth. Jamie gasped for air, struggling to regain his bearings, to make sense of where he was. The fog, thick, suffocating, unyielding, clung to the edges of his vision, the mist swallowing the faint outline of his surroundings. As he slowly pushed himself to his feet, the ground beneath him trembled, an ominous vibration that seemed to come from deep below. His body screamed for him to move, to run, but he was paralyzed by the sheer terror of not knowing where to go. It was then that he noticed something that had gone unnoticed until now. The air was heavy with a faint, almost imperceptible hum. It wasn't a sound. Not exactly. It was more like a vibration in the air itself, a hum that made his teeth ache, his skin crawl. It felt like the earth was alive, like it was reaching out to him, pulling him into something ancient. Jamie took a step forward, and with that step, the mist around him seemed to shift. The fog parted, revealing what he had not been able to see before, an ancient, crumbling staircase leading downward into an inky darkness. The stairs were worn, cracked with age, and at the base of the stairs, he could just make out a faint glow, like a flickering candle flame. It beckoned him. He felt an overwhelming urge to go down the stairs, a compulsion that surged from deep within him. Despite the fear, despite the deep instinct to run, he couldn't stop himself. He moved toward the stairs, each step more deliberate than the last, the fog swirling tighter around his legs, almost as if trying to drag him back. As he descended, the hum grew louder, vibrating through his bones. The walls of the staircase seemed to pulse with it, as if the very stones were alive and aware of him. With each step, the glow grew brighter, and the oppressive weight of the air thickened, pushing against him from all sides. At the bottom of the stairs, Jamie found himself in a vast chamber, its walls hidden in shadow, its ceiling lost in the dark. The only source of light came from a single, dimly glowing object in the center of the room, a door. But it wasn't a regular door. This one was different. Made of an ancient, weathered wood that seemed to shimmer with a faint, sickly glow. It was old, far older than anything he had ever seen, and the aura it exuded was pure malevolence. As Jamie approached the door, the hum reached a crescendo, and the fog thickened even further, now swirling in the air around him like a living thing. The glow from the door flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows along the walls. And then he saw it. A face. A face that appeared in the shadows, etched into the very wood of the door itself. Its hollow eyes stared at him, unblinking, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The face seemed to move, subtly, as though it were breathing, as though it were alive. The voice returned, whispering, reverberating in his mind. "You should not have come." Jamie froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The face in the door seemed to leer at him, its grin widening as if it were pleased by his fear. He stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness around him seemed to press in closer, and the walls of the chamber seemed to close in, shifting with the weight of something darker than he could comprehend. And then, just as the fear seemed to reach its peak, the door creaked open. Slowly. Reluctantly. It groaned as if it had been waiting for centuries to open, to reveal what lay beyond. The glow grew brighter, and Jamie's heart thudded in his chest as he felt the air grow colder. The door opened just enough for him to glimpse what lay beyond, a hallway, long and narrow, stretching into a darkness so deep that it swallowed the faint light from the room. The hum grew louder, vibrating in his skull, and Jamie could feel the air growing denser, more oppressive. The very weight of the house seemed to shift, to lean toward him. He didn't want to enter. He knew he shouldn't. But something was pulling him forward, something he couldn't explain, something primal and ancient. It wasn't a voice this time, but a feeling, a pull. He couldn't ignore it. With shaking hands, Jamie took a step forward, into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crack, and the hallway ahead of him seemed to stretch endlessly, disappearing into the blackness. The air around him was suffocating now, and the hum had become a constant buzz, vibrating through every fiber of his being. As he walked deeper into the hall, he felt it, the presence. Something was watching him. It was no longer a distant feeling. It was right behind him, close enough that he could feel its breath, cold and clammy on the back of his neck. His heart raced, and his breathing became shallow as he pressed on, every step more labored than the last. He had to know. He had to find the source of the darkness, the origin of the voice, of the pull that had brought him here. But the deeper he went, the stronger the feeling became, like the house itself was alive, aware of him, watching him. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway, waiting. Its silhouette was vague, its shape shifting in the fog, but Jamie could feel its gaze, unblinking, cold, and heavy. He stopped in his tracks, his legs shaking beneath him, and stared at the figure. It was the same shadow he had seen earlier in the woods, the same presence that had followed him. But now, it was waiting for him, standing at the end of the hallway, its figure solidifying, revealing more details with every passing second. Its long, twisted limbs stretched toward him, the shadow that loomed over him growing taller with each step it took. Jamie tried to move, but his body refused to obey. He was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak. And then, the figure spoke, its voice cold, final, and filled with dread. You cannot leave. Not now. Not ever. Chapter 5, The Unseen Truth. The words of the figure hung in the air like a curse, their chilling resonance sinking into Jamie's bones. You cannot leave. Not now. Not ever. The voice seemed to echo, not from its mouth, but from every corner of the darkened hallway, as if the walls themselves were speaking. The very house seemed to tremble with the weight of its declaration, and Jamie could feel every inch of the floor beneath his feet vibrating with its power. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the figure, his body betraying him as the fear coursed through him, paralyzing every muscle. The presence before him grew stronger, its silhouette shifting as if it were being pulled together from the very shadows. Slowly, its form took shape, its long, gangly arms stretched unnaturally wide, fingers curling like claws ready to strike. Jamie's breath caught in his throat as he felt the temperature in the hallway drop sharply. The cold crept into his skin, icy and unforgiving. The figure moved toward him, but not with haste. No, it moved with purpose, its steps slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. And Jamie, he realized, had no time left. His heart pounded, and his thoughts scrambled for an escape, for anything that could free him from the grip of this unnatural nightmare. His mind screamed for him to run, to flee, but the legs that once carried him now felt like lead, unresponsive, incapable of obeying the desperate commands. The figure's hollow eyes, black as pitch, seemed to pierce through Jamie, locking onto him with a predatory hunger. And then, it spoke again, its voice reverberating in Jamie's skull, louder now, as if it were inside his very mind. You belong to this place, it whispered, its words slithering like a serpent, wrapping around Jamie's consciousness. It's been waiting for you. Waiting for the one who would come and unlock the door. Jamie's pulse quickened. His throat tightened as he tried to speak, to say anything, but the words wouldn't come. His breath hitched, his chest heaving, as the truth began to sink in, the voice, the presence, the house itself. He had been drawn here. The house hadn't chosen him by accident. No, it had waited for him, like a predator lying in wait, until the moment was right. And now that moment had arrived. Jamie could feel the weight of the house closing in around him, as though the walls were pushing inward, shrinking the space, trapping him in this nightmare. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, suffocating him with each passing second. Do you understand? The figure hissed, its eyes narrowing as it moved closer, its feet now barely making a sound on the floor. You are the key, Jamie, the one who opens the way. And now, you must face what lies behind that door. The figure's form flickered, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a shadow caught in a storm. It was almost as if it was flickering in and out of existence, an entity trapped between worlds, yet it exuded a power that felt real, that Jamie could feel deep in his bones. The door, the one at the end of the hallway, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, its surface flickering with the same unsettling glow Jamie had seen earlier. He wanted to turn away, to run, but his body refused to cooperate. His eyes were drawn to it, as though something in his very soul was telling him that he had no choice. He had to face whatever lay beyond that door. "You think you can escape," the figure murmured, as if reading Jamie's thoughts. "But you can't. You've already passed the threshold. Now, you must know the truth. The truth." Jamie could feel the word vibrating in his mind, like an echo from a distant time. The figure was right. He had already crossed into something deeper, something darker than he could have ever imagined. And the truth that awaited him was a truth that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Before Jamie could process the weight of its words, the figure lifted one long, spindly hand and pointed toward the door. The darkness around them seemed to fold in on itself, coiling around Jamie's legs, wrapping around his chest, pulling him forward with an irresistible force. The door creaked open, slowly, unwillingly, as if the house itself was reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The faint, sickly glow from within spilled out into the hallway, casting twisted, contorted shadows on the walls. The air around Jamie became heavier, thicker, and the ground beneath him seemed to buckle, shifting in ways that defied logic. With the figure's cold gaze still locked on him, Jamie took a tentative step forward, his legs trembling beneath him, his mind screaming to turn back, to escape, to run. But there was no turning back now. The door was open. The way had been unlocked. And as Jamie crossed the threshold, he was hit by an overwhelming wave of cold, an oppressive chill that seemed to freeze him from the inside out. He stepped into a vast, dark chamber, larger than any room he had ever seen. The walls were smooth and black, like obsidian, reflecting nothing but an endless void. The air was thick with a presence, ancient, malevolent, watching. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, bathed in the sickly light from the door behind him. And atop that pedestal was a book. Its cover was old, weathered, but the faint glow seemed to emanate from it as though it had a life of its own. The pages were curled, as if the book had been waiting for centuries, untouched by time. Jamie felt an unexplainable pull toward it, as if the book was calling him, beckoning him closer. He took another step, his fingers itching to touch it, to open it, to uncover the secrets within. His mind raced with questions, with the desire to know what had been hidden, what had been waiting for him all this time. But as his hand hovered over the book, a voice, low and cold, whispered from the darkness around him. "Do you understand now, Jamie? The truth is not for the faint of heart. Once you open this book, there is no going back. Once you learn what it holds, it will become a part of you, forever." Jamie's heart pounded in his chest. The book was a key to something far older, far darker than he could comprehend. But his curiosity, the pull, the inexplicable need to know, overwhelmed him. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached out and touched the cover. The moment his fingers made contact, the world around him shifted. The room seemed to warp, the walls closing in, and the shadows around him twisted and shrank, as if the very darkness was being consumed by the book. The glow from the pedestal intensified, blinding him for a moment, before the light snapped off entirely, plunging the room into absolute darkness. And then, nothing. Chapter 6: The Awakening. The darkness was suffocating, a heavy, palpable presence that seemed to weigh down on Jamie's chest, pressing him further into the abyss. His heart raced in his ears, thumping wildly as the chill of the room seeped deeper into his skin, his bones. The only sound was the faint buzzing in his head, the hum of something ancient and powerful. The air itself felt thick with something old, something he wasn't meant to understand. His fingers, still pressed against the book, tingled with an unnatural energy, as if the very pages within were alive, pulsating with an unearthly rhythm. A sudden realization struck him. He had made a grave mistake. The book, the knowledge it held. He had known, on some level, that once he touched it, he would be bound to whatever it contained, that he would awaken something far older than he could fathom. But the temptation, the pull, was too much. Now, there was no going back. A faint, distant whisper echoed in the darkness, as if the very air was alive with secrets. The voice, low, distant, and unintelligible, seemed to swirl around him, growing louder, clearer with each passing second. The words were unintelligible at first, mere murmurs. But slowly, they began to form, coalescing into something tangible. You shouldn't have opened it. The words were both a warning and a promise, and Jamie could feel their weight settle on him like a physical force. His mind began to race, his thoughts scattering as the shadows around him seemed to grow deeper, darker. The book in his hands felt heavier, impossibly so, as if it had become a vessel for the darkness itself. He tried to pull his hand away, but his fingers wouldn't move. They were glued to the cover of the book, and with each attempt to break free, he felt something tugging at him, an unseen force pulling him deeper into the darkness. And then, as if answering his silent plea for release, the room shifted. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to quake, the very foundation of the space trembling. The shadows around him writhed, twisting like living creatures, slithering along the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And within that twisting mass of darkness, shapes began to emerge, figures, distorted and otherworldly, coalescing into forms that Jamie couldn't comprehend. Some were humanoid, others, twisted horrors that defied all logic, their features jagged and cruel. The whispering grew louder, filling his head with voices, hundreds, thousands, overlapping and echoing in his skull. The words were not his own, but they felt like his thoughts, his voice, a part of him that had been there all along. And though he couldn't understand them, he knew that the book had opened a door, one that should never have been opened. The figures in the shadows began to move toward him, their twisted limbs reaching out with hunger. Their eyes, hollow, black, voids of nothingness, locked onto him, pinning him in place. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the floor warping beneath his feet. "It's too late, Jamie," the voice whispered, now clearer than ever, now unmistakable. "You are the door. You are the key. You have unleashed it. You are ours." The figures advanced, their bodies shuddering with a strange, inhuman energy, the air vibrating with their malevolent presence. Jamie felt a wave of nausea hit him as he tried to take a step back, but the floor gave way beneath him once again, as if the very ground were pulling him down. He stumbled, falling, and this time, there was no floor to catch him. He fell, deeper, into an endless void, the darkness swallowing him whole. The figures, the whispers, they all faded, becoming distant echoes as Jamie descended further into the abyss. There was no light here, only the oppressive weight of darkness, only the endless, unyielding pull of something ancient. And then, in an instant, the darkness was gone. He gasped for air, his breath coming in ragged gasps as his eyes adjusted to the dim light around him. He wasn't in the chamber anymore. The room had vanished, replaced by something far worse, an endless, empty expanse, stretching as far as the eye could see. The ground beneath him was cracked and barren, like the remnants of an old, forgotten world. The sky above him was an expanse of swirling red and black, the clouds churning with an unnatural energy. There was no sun here, no moon, only the endless void. Jamie stood there, disoriented, his mind reeling from what he had just experienced. He had opened a door. He had unleashed the unknown. And now, it seemed, he was trapped in this place, this dark realm where nothing made sense, where time itself seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding him down. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure he knew all too well. The figure was the same one from the hallway, the same one that had been waiting for him. It moved with a predatory grace, its limbs elongated, its face now fully visible, its eyes black voids that seemed to consume the very light around them. A cold smile curled on its lips. "Welcome, Jamie," the figure said, its voice a low, raspy hiss. "You've finally arrived. You've finally opened the way." Jamie's heart pounded in his chest, panic rising like bile in his throat. He had to get away. He had to find a way out. But there was nowhere to run. No escape. The figure took another step toward him, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "There is no escape now," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "You've opened the door, and now you must walk through it." Jamie's breath caught in his throat as the figure reached out, its fingers curling toward him, cold and unforgiving. He could feel the darkness pressing in, could feel it seeping into his skin, into his soul. The void, the emptiness, this was where he belonged now. This was where he had been brought. There was no way out. There never had been. The figure's fingers brushed against his skin, and the moment it did, the world around Jamie twisted once more, everything distorting, bending, folding in on itself. And then, nothing. Chapter 7, The Endless Cycle. Jamie's body jerked upright, gasping for air. His heart hammered in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears, louder than the silence that surrounded him. He opened his eyes, but it was the same. The same desolate void stretched out before him, an endless expanse of broken ground and swirling darkness. The sky was no different, twisted, red and black, swirling like a storm in an eternal cycle. He rubbed his eyes, blinking, as if to convince himself that it was real, that this was really happening. But the world didn't change. The emptiness didn't go away. The figure, the one with the black, hollow eyes, stood a few feet away, watching him with that same predatory grin. It hadn't moved, but Jamie could feel it, the presence, looming, omnipresent. It was all around him. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Nothing came out. "You think you can escape," the figure whispered, its voice a low hiss, like the wind through dead branches. "But there is no escape. Not for you. Not here." Jamie's stomach twisted with panic, and his mind raced in a panic. He had to find a way out. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. He had to wake up. He had to. This is real, Jamie. The figure's voice echoed in his mind, mocking him, laughing at the very core of his fear. You've entered a place beyond your understanding. The house called you, and now you are bound to it. This realm, this dimension, is yours now. There is no waking up. There is only the truth. Jamie stepped back, his feet feeling like they were sinking into the cracked earth beneath him. His pulse was racing, his mind in overdrive. What did the figure mean? What truth? He had opened the book that had called him here. The book that had bound him to this endless, suffocating cycle. The figure's smile grew wider, a grin that stretched unnaturally across its face, twisting its features in a grotesque mockery of joy. It's too late for you to turn back, Jamie. The book has chosen you. And once chosen, there is no release. Jamie's thoughts were spinning, each realization worse than the last. He had unleashed something that had been waiting for centuries, something that had existed in the shadows, in the very fabric of the world. And now, whatever that something was, it had him. It had bound him to this cursed dimension, this nightmare from which there was no escape. But there has to be a way, Jamie breathed, his voice cracking as the weight of his situation became more real than ever before. He felt a growing sense of helplessness, of despair, as the figure inched closer, its long limbs stretching toward him. You will never escape, Jamie. You are a part of it now. You are the door. The figure's grin deepened, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. And now, you will walk the path, over and over, as it always was meant to be. The ground beneath Jamie's feet began to tremble, as if the very foundations of the realm were beginning to shift. The air thickened, and a low, guttural rumble echoed from somewhere deep in the void, a sound so ancient it seemed to shake the stars themselves. The figure's eyes gleamed, its form now looming over Jamie. The cycle is complete. Before Jamie could react, the world around him began to blur. The shadows stretched out, twisting into new shapes, distorting the very landscape. The broken earth seemed to bend and crack, opening up into new rifts, dark and endless. It was as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling before his eyes. And then, without warning, everything stopped. The world went silent. And Jamie found himself standing at the edge of a familiar place, the house. The house that had led him here. The house that had called him, in the dead of night, whispering in his ears, urging him to step inside. The door. The front door of the house stood wide open, beckoning him forward. Jamie's breath caught in his throat. He was back. It was as if time had reset. He was standing in the same yard, looking at the same house, but this time, the fog seemed thicker, the air heavier. The house loomed in front of him, its windows dark and lifeless, but the door was open. No. It couldn't be. Not again. He had just come from there, from that terrible realm, from the endless cycle. He had opened the door, and yet, here he was, standing before it once more, the house calling him in. The whispers began again, soft at first, growing louder as Jamie stepped forward, his feet moving of their own accord. They were calling to him, urging him to step inside. The pull was undeniable. The house was pulling him in, and he couldn't stop himself. You've always been here, Jamie. This is your home now. He reached out, his hand trembling as he stepped toward the door, his mind screaming at him to resist, to turn away, but the house's grip on him was unrelenting. His fingers brushed against the doorknob. The moment he touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was something worse, something that felt like an awakening. Something that felt like the final step in a process that had begun long before he ever stepped foot in this cursed house. The door creaked open slowly, and Jamie felt himself drawn inside. As he crossed the threshold, everything changed again. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a place that lived, that breathed. It had been waiting for him, for the moment when he would finally unlock the truth. And now, Jamie understood. This wasn't the beginning. And this wasn't the end. It was the cycle. The endless cycle. He would never leave. Chapter 8, The Eternal Return. The door slammed shut behind Jamie with a deafening crash. The sound reverberated in his skull, an ominous confirmation that there was no turning back. He felt the cold, familiar air of the house wash over him, heavy and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the floorboards creaking under his weight as if the house itself was alive, shifting, breathing with a malevolent purpose. He had crossed the threshold once again, and now there was no escape. Jamie's feet moved on their own accord, dragging him through the darkened hallway, toward a destination he already knew, a place he had walked through so many times before. The light flickered overhead, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed against the walls. The smell of decay lingered in the air, sharp and sickening, yet Jamie didn't fight it anymore. He couldn't. He was back. Back where he belonged. Or was he? The whispers, soft and insistent, echoed in the corners of his mind, growing louder with each step. You can't leave. You never could. They were the same words, the same haunting presence that had followed him from the moment he entered this house. The same dark voice that had lulled him into a false sense of security, only to tear it all away, to drag him deeper into its labyrinth. Jamie stopped in front of the old staircase that led up to the second floor. He remembered this place, the rickety steps, the creaking wood, the eerie silence that had once filled the air. But now, the silence was thick with anticipation, heavy with the weight of what he knew was about to come. Something was waiting for him upstairs. Without thinking, he climbed the stairs, his hand gripping the railing as if it could anchor him in this nightmare. The walls around him closed in tighter, the shadows pressing closer, as if the house were alive, watching him, knowing what he had done, what he had unlocked. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched out before him. The rooms were all closed off, but one door stood slightly ajar, the soft glow from within casting an unnatural light into the hallway. He didn't need to see the room to know what was inside. He had seen it before, and every time he had entered, it had been the same. The figure. It was always there, waiting for him. It was never gone. It never left. His hand trembled as he pushed open the door. Inside, the room was as he remembered it, dimly lit, its walls lined with faded wallpaper, the furniture covered in dusty sheets. In the center of the room, standing motionless, was the figure. The shadow. It was tall, impossibly so, its long limbs stretching up into the air, its black eyes staring at him with a malevolent hunger. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Jamie could feel it. Its presence was suffocating, closing in on him, wrapping around him like an unbreakable chain. "You've come back," it said, its voice deep and guttural, like the rumble of thunder. "And now, you will stay." Jamie's chest tightened, his throat constricting as panic surged through him. He wanted to run, to escape, but his feet felt like they were stuck in place. The house, the figure, everything, was pulling him in, urging him to accept his fate. "You're part of this now, Jamie. You always have been, the figure continued, its smile growing wider. The blackness of its eyes deepened, as if it were devouring the very light of the room. The house has chosen you, and now you will walk its halls forever. You will be the keeper of its secrets. The walls of the room began to shift, the wallpaper peeling away, revealing layers upon layers of old, forgotten messages, words written in an ancient language, their meaning lost to time. The floor beneath Jamie's feet groaned, shifting as though the house itself were alive, moving, waiting. "No," Jamie whispered, his voice barely audible as his body trembled with fear. "I can't stay here. I have to leave." The figure tilted its head, its grin widening further, as if amused by his words. "Leave?" it said softly. "You think you can leave? You think you can escape the house? No, Jamie. There is no leaving here. You belong to this place now. You are its blood, its breath. And you will stay here. Forever." Suddenly, the walls around him began to close in, pressing against him with an unnatural force. The shadows of the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes, human forms, monstrous forms, like they were reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. The whispers, the voice of the house, grew louder, more insistent, until it was all Jamie could hear. "You can't run. You can't hide. You belong here now. This is your fate. This is your home." His breath came in shallow gasps, his body frozen, as if bound by invisible chains. The house was alive, a living, breathing entity, and it had claimed him. The figure moved closer, its long fingers outstretched toward him. Jamie could feel its cold touch, like ice against his skin. The air thickened, pressing down on him, and Jamie felt himself sinking, falling, deeper into the darkness. His heart raced in his chest as the figure's grip tightened, dragging him closer to the abyss, to the endless void that waited for him. And then, the door slammed shut, and everything went black. Chapter 9. The Final Binding. The darkness was absolute. Jamie couldn't feel his body. His eyes were open, but nothing existed around him, no sound, no light, no air. It was as if he were floating in an infinite void, his very essence suspended between worlds. Time, it seemed, had no meaning here. He wasn't sure how long he had been trapped in this space. It could have been seconds or centuries. The concept of time was lost in this place. But he wasn't alone. Somewhere in the vast emptiness, he could feel it, a presence, cold and vast, like an ocean of darkness surrounding him, suffocating him. It was there, waiting, watching. And as he floated in this void, Jamie understood. The house, the figure, the endless cycle, it had all been leading to this moment. He had been brought here, to the heart of the darkness. And now, it was time to face what lay beyond. He tried to move, to escape, but his body refused to obey. The house had bound him to this place, to the cycle that it had woven for so long. The weight of the house's presence pressed down on him, like an invisible force wrapping around his chest, squeezing the breath from him. There was no escape from it. And then, the voice returned. The same voice that had haunted him throughout this entire nightmare. Low, guttural, endless, it echoed in his mind like a thunderstorm. "You've come far, Jamie. You've opened the door, unlocked the house's secrets, and now you belong to it. Forever." The voice wasn't just speaking. It was inside his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, consuming them, drowning them in a cold, oppressive darkness. Jamie could feel his consciousness bending, warping under the weight of it. "The house is not just a house," the voice whispered, its tone dark and full of ancient power. "It is a prison. A prison for souls like yours. And once you enter, you can never leave." Jamie's heart pounded in his chest as the realization hit him. This place wasn't just a house. It was something more, a prison that trapped souls, that devoured them. And now, it had him. He was part of it. Bound to it. The figure appeared before him, emerging from the shadows like a specter. Its eyes were cold, black voids, and its body was twisted, elongated, like a grotesque marionette controlled by unseen strings. Its smile was wide, cruel, and full of malice. "You think you can escape the cycle," the figure said, its voice like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "But you cannot. You've been trapped here before you even stepped foot into the house. It was always meant to be this way." Jamie's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the figure, helpless to move, helpless to fight. He knew now that this wasn't just a nightmare. This was his fate. This was his eternity. The house had chosen him, had called to him, and now he would be part of it forever. The figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers brushing against Jamie's skin. The touch was cold, like death itself. As it made contact, Jamie felt a surge of energy, an ancient, malevolent force coursing through his body, binding him to the house. His vision blurred as the world around him seemed to twist and collapse, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. "You are the door now, Jamie," the figure said, its voice full of triumph. "The house lives through you. The cycle begins again, and you will lead others into this prison, as you have been led. Forever." Jamie's vision went black as the energy consumed him, his body sinking into the shadows, becoming one with the house. And then, there was nothing. Epilogue, the next victim. The house stood silent, its windows dark, its doors locked, its halls empty. For now. But deep within its walls, something stirred. Something ancient, something powerful. The cycle had begun again. Somewhere, far off, a new soul approached, drawn by the whispers, pulled by the house's malevolent call. They had heard the stories, the rumors, the tales of the house at the edge of town, a place where no one dared to go. But they were curious, as all the others had been. They would step inside, thinking they could leave whenever they chose. But they would never leave. Because the house had chosen them, too. And soon, they would join the others, trapped forever in the endless cycle, bound to the house just like Jamie, just like the ones before him. The door would open. The figure would wait. And the darkness would consume another soul. The house never let go. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.